Hey guys, welcome to the session by K21 Academy. In this session, we are going to learn about AWS Web Application Firewall, where we will be focusing on how to control web traffic using Web Application Firewall. Now let us take a quick glance at the agenda. Firstly, we will be introduced to AWS Web Application Firewall, and then we will be launching two web servers in two different availability zones. And then we will be configuring application load balancer in front of that, and we will test our application. Post that, we will be creating IP set, which is nothing but set of IPs using which we can control and say who can access and all. IP set is not only the way, there are other things as well which we can do. Like web application firewall is quite advanced thing, right? And then we will see how to create a web access control list which will say what exactly you are controlling. And finally, we will be testing the working of web application firewall. So we have taken a clip from one of our certification training program on AWS Certified Solution Architect Associate SAAC02, and in this clip our expert will talk about AWS Web Application Firewall, where we will focus on how to control web traffic using Web Application Firewall.
Hey there, welcome back. This is Atul from team K21 Academy, and in this lesson we are going to look at how to use Web Application Firewall or WAF to control the web traffic for pointing to some of the services that are pointing to Amazon Web Services or AWS. So Web Application Firewall is a security tool that is used to protect your couple of services which I'll explain you in a minute. But before I tell you what all things or what index page as we usually do, what we are going to cover or what does web application means, I think it will be better to explain this via the diagram. So if you have services like there are couple of services like application load balancer, or you have app sync or content delivery network CDN, couple of these services or API gateway, you can access these directly, which is fine, but you can also put web application firewall, which is a WAF, in front of these applications so that you can control within WAF layer to define some rules and say what is allowed, what is not allowed. And you can go to a very advanced rules that you can define in AWS. So when users hitting your application load balancer or your app sync, which is content delivery network CDN or API gateways, they will first connect to the WAF, and WAF will then allow or deny based on the rule you define, and then will let you configure this. So what we are going to do in this lab is we'll configure web servers and application load balancer so that these will be used in my WAF. Now, how to configure application load balancer and web servers you should have done in one of the previous labs. And if not, I would suggest you do that, because first, or at least have an understanding. In this lab, I'm going to show you again how to create web server or application load balancer, but I'm not going to go in depth about application load balancer. We covered these load balancers in one of the previous labs, but the focus will be on AWS WAF and what is IP set, and Web ACL will tell you about that as well. So we'll be defining these for WAF, and then when I'm accessing my load balancer, depending on the rules that I've set, I'll be allowed or disallowed on this here for testing for WAF. So that's what I'm going to do in this particular lab. So first, let's see WAF, a little background about WAF. Web Application Firewall helps to protect your web applications against common web exploits that might affect availability and of your application and compromise the security of your application as well. Now, what are the features of the WAF? You can look and read it in there, but you can do a lot of things in here. As I said, now if I go a little bit further down on what we are doing on this particular lab, so this is saying that you can configure WAF with these kind of resources like application load balancer, or you can also use it for Amazon API gateway, which is a gateway for your APIs, application programming interfaces. You can build your developers, your applications can have APIs, and that APIs will be front-ended by API gateway. You can use that, or AWS App Sync. So AppSync provides a robust, scalable GraphQL interface for application developers to combine data from multiple data sources like Amazon DynamoDB, AWS Lambda, or other things. And if you don't understand, don't worry about it. Assume that this is something related to GraphQL. And then you can also use it for CloudFront distribution. We'll see all these as we come across, and I'll let you know about that as well. So that's what we are going to do and this. So to see what we are going to do all in this particular lab, so first is, as always, introduction. You can read a little bit more about. Second point is about documentation link that we have used in order to create this WAF, and where exactly, what all places you can use WAF. Those things we have written links into this chapter 2. Chapter 3 about prerequisite. Now prerequisite is it's better if you have done a application load balancer lab before this, so that I'm going to do it again here, but I'll not go as deep as I went into application load balancer. I'll keep it high level. And why we are doing application load balancer again here is because the WAF that I'm going to put in front, I'm going to do it for in front of application load balancer. So then we are going to do two instances, web server 1 and web server 2 in two different availability zones. And then we'll be configuring application load balancer in front of that, and I'll test my application for this. Then I'm going to create something called as IP set. And IP set is nothing but a set of IPs that using which you can control and say who can access or what. Now, IP set is not the only way. There are other things as well you can do. So WAF is a quite advanced thing. We are going to use IP set for this. Then we are going to create a ACL, access control list, or web ACL we say, which is access control list, which will say what exactly you can do or what you're controlling. Now again, as I said earlier, WAF is a little bit more advanced. You can do a lot of other things as well, but for now we are going to keep things simple. And if you want to go deep, you can go from a associate point of view. Whatever you're learning, WAF is more than enough here from the certification point of view. So we'll create a access control list, and then we'll test that. We are going to first access it directly by application load balancer, and then I'm going to create a access control list, and which is say deny my IP. And then when I try to access, it will be not, I'll not be able to access because it's blocked by this IP list or is a WAF. And then I'll open up and then test it, see I can access it or not. So that's once it's done, I'm going to delete or clean up resources. So this is what I'm going to do. So first thing first is we create two web servers. Again, we have already done these things in past. So I'm going to keep it short and quick in this here. And I'll only focus on things that are required here. So we are creating these two web servers. So we'll create an instance 1 in my US East 1, and we'll select an EC2. And then in EC2, I'm going to launch an instance of type Linux and then T2 micro, and we are going to put this code. We have done this in past as well. So let me copy it, saying web server 1. So I'm on AWS console and we'll go EC2. Now we have done this exercise number of times, so it should be fairly easy. And as I said earlier, if you have not done, maybe go for application load balancer first. So we'll say launch an instance. Select type Linux of Amazon Linux. Select T2 micro. And then we will put it in availability zone 1A maybe. We have the public IP already enabled. And under bottom data here, we will say that we're installing a root. And again, as I said, I've already done this exercise. So I'm creating a HTTP server, installing HTTP server in this. Click on add storage. We'll leave it to the default 8 GB. And we add a tag called name and say server 1 security group. We'll add 22 port number, and we'll also add port number 80 from internet. So which is HTTP port. Click on review and launch and say launch it. Key pairs I already have. So I'll say select key pair, existing key pair, and click on launch instance. While it's launching, I'll create one more instance. So say launch instance, one more. We select T2 micro. This time I'm going to do it on availability zone 2. So 1B. We'll say IP address is assigned, and my user data, this time I'm going to select for my second page. So for this is web server 02, and say add storage 8 GB, add tags, name is server 02 or server 2. Next, launch security group, and we'll be selecting the existing group. So I just need to figure out what security group I gave earlier. So I gave security group name as launch wizard 10. So I should be using the same security group, which is launch wizard 10. So I'll go back to launch instance, select T2 micro, here A1B, select under optional these parameters, add storage, click on add tags. Tag is name is equal to server 2. Security group, I'll say select an existing, and I selected the existing one 10. So launch wizard 10, this is the one which was their security group. If you want, you could remember name next time you remember these names. Click on review and launch and say launch, and you should already have the key pair. Now once launching, I'll go back to the instances and see whether you can access these for both the pages or not. So I'll go to the first instance, server 1, collect the public IP, and then you open the browser HTTP and then colon // and then hit enter, and this is coming web server 1. Now we are going to do on the second one. So I'll go to the second instance, I'll copy the IP address of this, type HTTP, and we did this exercise again in the load balancer when we were doing web server 2. Now I'm ready to define a load balancer. So I'll go to scroll down here, or let's look at the documentation. So now we are going to go to the load balancer and we'll say create a load balancer, and we type HTTP type load balancer, and we'll say my application load balancer IPv4, and we'll select my two availability zone A and B, and then we'll pick up we'll define a listener, and in that listener we will configure a route tables, the routing. We'll select and we'll select a new routing Linux instance ALB security group, and we'll allow port number 80 and 22 from the internet, and then we'll say allow the instances, Linux instances, and we've done these two, so we'll be adding our two instances that are running, and we'll create the load balancer, and we'll test that I can access from the load balancer. So I'll go to the load balancers, click on create a load balancer, I'll type HTTP load balancer. We'll name the load balancer maybe my ALB, my-ALB. We'll select internet facing IPv4 listening on port number 80, and we'll pick A and B availability zones, and then say click on next, configure security group. It's saying load balancer is not using any secure listener. We are okay. Click on next, and you say create a new security group, and I think that's what we are doing up here. No, so we are not creating a new security group. We are actually creating using a existing security group that we did, which was for in my case it was 10. So Linux security group was 10, launch security group, launch wizard 10. And I think if you follow the guide, if you hit any problem, follow the guide. That guide will explain you the exact steps or which security group. This is so that my ports are allowed for. So say configure a routing, and here my target group, and we'll say target group as Linux instances, and my protocol as they are listening. These are instances. This is listening on port number 80, and click on register targets. And we will be selecting these two targets and say add registered. So you see these are the registered two servers which are listening. Click on next review and click on create and click on close. And then we will be getting, you should be able to refresh them, and state should be provisioned, and we'll wait for them to be provisioned. So we'll wait. And what I'm going to do is once these are ready, my state should be active, and once it's active, I'll be looking up from the DNS name record here, and then I'll try to access the web servers. I should be able to access my load balancers from this from the URL. So this is my DNS name. I'll copy this and type HTTP, then type this URL. This URL will not work yet because we are still configuring it. So this EC2 is still provisioning, And once it's provisioned, then we will come to know. So let's refresh it. My load balancer is now fully active. So I'm going to go and check my DNS name here and then open a new tab and type HTTP. And this again exercise we already did it in past. So hit the load balancer and now it's coming from web server 1. You click on refresh here and you should be getting from web server 2 and like that. So it's basically my load balancer is working fine. Now I'm all set to create my WAF. So WAF will have two things. It can have much more complex things. So I'm going to create two things simple, make it simple so that you understand and don't overwhelm yourself. And then if you want, if you're using WAF in project, you can go and a little bit more advanced. But from certification point of view, or to give you idea about web application firewall, we try to keep things simple. So we'll be first creating an IP set, which is nothing but a set of IP addresses. You can have IP address. And for that, we will be going to my WAF, and then I'll define IP set. And IP set will be my IP from which I'm accessing these URLs. I can check. I'll tell you what is my IP. If you want to check what is your IP or public IP that AWS or my application load balancer is seeing, I can go here and it'll tell me what is my IP address or public IP, which is when I hit these any other computer on the internet, this is what my IP is being seen here. So this is my IPv6 and I'm more interested on IPv4. So this is my IPv4 is this, which is 81.130.234.235. This is the IP address. IP. So that will be I'll be using later. So I'll be defining this IP set, and then later I'm going to use this IP set that I've created in my access control list. So let's go to AWS console and create an IP set. So this is my EC2 instance. Sorry, not EC2. This is my load balancer, and I'll go for search for WAF. And this is my WAF and shield. I'll explain you. Shield is nothing but DDoS, distributed denial of service attack. So we'll click on this first to see. Now within WAF and shield, you have three parts. One is AWS WAF, and there is a AWS Firewall Manager. We have not covered Firewall Manager, but there is another component called AWS Shield, which provides you distributed denial of service attack, DDoS. It protects you against DDoS for your applications, which is distributed denial of service attack. So I'll not go into there. We go back and say we look at WAF, and this is where you see multiple things on WAF here. So you can define access control list, IP sets, and you can go a little bit more advanced with regular pattern sets or rule groups, which you can use when you're defining access control list. So access control list will be using my IP set or these rule groups or regular expressions. And in ACL is actually where I'm saying what to protect and how to protect. So first, IP set is from where to protect. So we'll say create a IP set. So we first say my IP set. So we'll put it my IP set, and then name my IP set, whatever IP set, and you define this IP set in a specific region and my IP address. So IP address will be whatever I picked up plus, and then it should always be in CIDR format. So it's CIDR 32. 32 is that specific IP. You can pick a range of IP addresses. Again, what is that CIDR we covered when we looked at, or maybe I think it's in the next module, it's going to cover what is CIDR when we do look at the VPC, virtual private cloud, or it's already been, I don't remember on which module we did VPC, but in VPC I've given a brief overview about this CIDR. Now 32 means that's just one IP, which is this IP, and say create a IP set, and my IP set is successfully created here. Now I'm ready to create my access control list, and the access control list will control or give you a fine-grained control over the web to say what you want to protect. You can protect CloudFront, which is my content delivery network. You can protect API gateway, which is my a gateway or interface for my APIs, where all my APIs host application programming interfaces, and then application load balancer we saw. You can also use for AWS AppSync, which is the GraphQL, which we saw used by developers. So you can, if you want to know more about what is AppSync or API gateway or CloudFront, I should have the documentation under the documentation section. So here we can control and say what to allow or block. So we'll go to Web ACL and say create Web ACL. Let me make it slightly bigger. And then we put name ACL, my web ACL, and we'll say that ACL to block my IP. So I'll be restricting the access on my URL. So let me go to the ACL and show it there. So here I'll select web ACL, and by default there's nothing. So I'll say create web ACL. And by the way, this WAF has changed. Earlier it used to be classic web application firewall. New WAF has come with more advanced things and more mature product. So we'll be using the new WAF. So we'll click on create access control list. And here you specify name of the access control list. So we'll say my ACL. And then you use a meaningful name. So this is description to say block my public IP. So we are saying block access. And you will be defining CloudWatch metrics. And what is CloudWatch? I think if you have not covered, it's going to cover. It's for monitoring part. Now this is where you say what kind of a resource type you want to protect. Is it a CloudFront distribution? And CloudFront distribution is a content delivery network CDN distribution, which it takes from where your content should be delivered. Or you can use the regional resources, which is like application load balancer, API gateway, or AWS AppSync. We want to use with application load balancer, so we'll select this. And now it's saying where this ACL will reside. This ACL will reside in US East. And now we need to look at the associated resources, what all AWS resources we want to do. So we'll say add AWS resources, and we specify application load balancer here. And because you've already created a load balancer, this load balancer is visible here. So we'll select this load balancer and click on add. So we are associating this rule or my web access control with this particular resource. Click on next. And this is interesting. This can become a little bit more complex. So that is where we are trying to keep things simple. And we'll say that you can add a rule. So we are saying add a rule, and then you can say add a managed rule group, which is the rule group we earlier saw, or add my own. So this is the rule groups that are managed by AWS. This is my own rule and rule group. We're going to keep things simple. So we'll say add my own rule, and then we will say rule name. So this is where we'll say we select what you are typing. Rule type, is it a IP set, or you can build a rule builder or rule group. So these can go a little bit more complex. We're saying IP set, we are going to use IP set here. And then we'll specify the name of this. So maybe say my name is my web ACL rule, and then IP set is the IP set that we created earlier, which is my IP set. Now you can identify IP based on IP address in a header or IP address in source IP address. What happens is when a HTTP request comes to the load balancer, or any app HTTP, they also have IP addresses defined in a header, or IP addresses actual source IP address. So we want to do it based on a source IP address. And action, what you want to do, you want to allow, block, or count, and we want to block it so that we can feel or we can test it, and say add a rule. So once we have blocked it, we have added a rule now, and then let's go to the next point. And this is where in this next is add rule, and this is very powerful as well. So say if there is any request that doesn't match, what to do? Should I allow or block? So means if the request IP is something else, should we allow for that or deny that? So it's very careful. So for remaining IPs, we want to allow. It's only my IP that we want to block. So this is for if you have a rogue IP that you want to block, or you want to say, I want to allow only from a specific IPs, you can control all those things here. So we say for remaining, if the ACL doesn't match any other, so if request is coming from any other IP like your IP, you are accessing, but my IP is blocked. So we'll say allow, click on next. And then the rule priority is, again, if you have multiple rules, you can define the rule priority and you can move rules. In my case, I have the default one rule only. Click on next, and you can leave the default one as well here. We are defining the metrics here. Click on next, and then you go and click on create web ACL. And this is now will create ACL. So now once we have created this rule, now it's time to test whether this is working, WAF is working fine or not. So I'll go back to the load balancer and try to access the same URL again. So this is my WAF. This rule is already created successfully, which says access to block my IP address. And let me go to now my ALB. and pick up the load balancer URL again. I think I accidentally closed it. So I'll go back to the application load balancer. Under here, load balancers. You create your DNS name, copy it from here, open the new tab, paste it, and type HTTP in front of this, and colon and forward slash, hit enter. And now you get 403 forbidden, which means you're not allowed to this. 403 means not allowed. You should be getting a page here. So to check back again, this is the issue, or my WAF is causing this. We'll go back to WAF again, and this time I'm going to delete the rule, and I should be then able to access again. So I go back to WAF, and in that I'm going to do web ACL. Select that web ACL and say delete, and type the word delete and click on delete. It's saying web couldn't because your resource is being used by another resource, or it's associated with another resource. So instead of deleting this ACL, I'll go to my IP set, and from my IP set, I'm going to delete this IP and say I don't want to use this, block this IP. Are you sure you want to delete the following IP? I say type confirm, type delete. So type word delete here and click on delete. Now if I try to refresh this page here, and let me see, maybe it'll take few seconds. So update IP set success, and let me check the document as well. I've deleted the IP address. It's being deleted. Okay, so we need to wait for a few minutes and refresh the page. So wait for a like this to be refreshed. And so if it doesn't happen, you need to, I think there is a little bit delay on AWS side for this IP to be picked up. So let me remove this from here, hit enter. It's still forbidden. Let me double check. So these IPs are gone. I go to web ACL and my web ACL. Okay, so sample request. Okay, this is rules inside define. So my web ACL, which is saying block, and if I see, just want to verify that my rule is IP set and source IP and address is still block. So we'll refresh it here. Now if I see I started getting a response back from web server 1 and server 2 and like that. And if I add by IP, I can now control and say allow or disallow. I can say block everything and only allow from these IPs. That's very powerful. You can restrict and control all that. That's a web application firewall. Now, once you've done this, make sure you take a screenshot of these two before you delete. Go back here under WAF and take a screenshot of IP set and ACL and say you've created an IP set and ACL. And then once that's done, you're ready to delete these. So in order to delete this or clean up, we'll delete the load balancer. We'll go and delete the target groups, and we'll be deleting the instances. So let me go one by one, and then we'll be deleting the IP set as well. So we'll select first here IP list, and probably it may not allow me. Let's see that, because I have to first saying it's in use. So click on delete. It's in WAF because it's being used. So we'll go to web ACL. Under web ACL, we'll go to rules, and then my web ACL, and say delete this rule. And I think my documentation would have been, if I would have looked into documentation, I would have been much better. So I've deleted this rule. And now I'll try to delete the whole ACL itself. So web ACL and say delete. Let's see, type word delete. Click on delete. It's still used by another resource. So let me see IP set. I should have looked at the document. Let's see if I can delete the IP set and say delete. So our IP set is gone. And now I'll see if I can delete my web ACL. Still not there. So I'll check and come back on the documentation. I should have looked into documentation. So delete ACL, web ACL, and say delete, and type word delete. I'm not sure why it's not letting me. So maybe I'll refresh it a little bit, this page again. Seems to be quite straightforward. So select and then delete and type word delete. Maybe I was trying to rush and web app couldn't perform the operation because the resource is being used by another resource and it's associated with another resource. So maybe it's somewhere used, but don't worry, you will not be charged for this ACL anyway. and I'll figure it out and we'll update this in the documentation as well once I figure out. But I'm going to go to my load balancer. So I'll go to EC2 and delete my load balancers before we getting being charged. So we'll go to target groups and select these instances and say actions, delete, and say yes, delete. Again, it's used by a listener, so I should first go and delete the listener. So I'll go to load balancers and select the load balancer action and say delete and say yes, delete my load balancer. Now I'll go and to the target groups actions and say delete and say yes, delete. And then I need to go to my EC2 instances and terminate both the instances that we have created. So say instance state and say terminate and click on terminate. So I've removed my instances, I've removed my load balancer, I've removed the backend servers. Let me see if I can WAF one more time and let me delete my WAF. So click on WAF and then select ACL and say delete and type word delete. And now I've successfully deleted. So maybe it was caching that. Oh, yes, sorry, I got the point now. Because in my ACL, I said that I have a load balancer, and that's why, because load balancer was blocking this. And that, since I deleted load balancer, my ACL is now gone. So with that, that completes this lab of configuring web application firewall. With that, this is Atul from team K21 Academy. Thanks for watching this, and I hope by now you've started a feel of how easy it is in AWS to configure things, and I hope you now started getting confidence.
So we have put down everything about the certification, including the basic concepts that one should know everything like introduction to AWS, security management AWS, object storage options, designing computing environment, networking and monitoring services, leverage Route 53 for hosting zones, database server and analytics, application and messaging services, configuration management and automation, architecting on AWS 1 and architecting on AWS 2. So in this training, we take you from basic to advanced level along with the tips and resources for clearing the certification exam. We also have a separate team working for CV preparation and on-job support. So if you want to become an AWS Certified Solution Architect Associate and want to learn right from basics to expert level, then we have a comprehensive step-by-step training for you that includes hands-on labs, including the exam preparation and most important part, 1 year on-job support. So if you are interested in this program, I would highly recommend you to attend the free class which covers most of the topics like why and who should learn AWS, cloud service deployment models and AWS services, demo on creating S3 bucket and making data available to the entire world, and many other topics. So if you are interested in this free class, you can visit k21academy.com/AWSSA02.